So we'll talk a little bit about exception handling and how we use it with sockets. Exception handling is useful because sockets can go wrong and we want to be able to catch that. So errors during execution. Any Python program can have errors during execution. And part of writing really robust code is handling those errors. So anticipating classes of things that might go wrong and then handling them in some way, writing some code that deals with the error somehow. Now, this isn't, we're not heavily talking about error handling, but with sockets we really want to a little bit because there's so many errors that can happen, so many conditions that can happen. You really want your code to be a little bit robust in the face of these errors. So errors can happen when working with sockets. Really, they can happen anywhere in Python, but they can happen when you're working with sockets. Common things like socket cannot be opened. So you try to open a socket on another end, and you can't open it. Maybe the server's not there or something like that, right? Data can't be sent for some reason. Data might be blocked. This type of thing happens in networks, right? So there are lots of errors that can happen when you're using sockets, and you want to be able to handle these errors. You don't want your machine to your code to just crash every time something like that happens. You'd like it to be able to print a response, tell you what's going on at least. So when errors happen during execution, they're called exceptions. And this isn't just with sockets, it's just in general in Python or other languages. You have what are called exceptions that are raised or thrown, however you want to call it. And there are many types of exceptions that can be raised for different functions. Okay, so the exception type tells you what kind of thing went wrong. So for instance, you can have an exception, a zero division error, right? And if that exception happens, you know somebody tried to divide by zero. You can have a type error, which means that you tried to perform an operation like, I don't know, on the wrong type. Like you tried to perform an add, like a floating point add on an integer or something like this, right? A type error. So there are lots of different types of error, different error classes, exception classes that can happen, depending on what kind of function you're calling, what kind of method you're calling. And sockets have their own set of errors and exceptions that we're going to want to handle, or at least a subset of them. So handling exceptions. So how do you handle an exception in general? So when an error happens, the idea of handling an exception is when the error happens, when the exception is raised, you want your code to do something appropriate. Now what it does is really, what's appropriate really depends on the application, okay, and what the error is. But you want something to happen. You want to control what happens. So the way you do this is you use these try and except statements. So there are try and except statements that are built into Python, which allow you to handle errors and exceptions as they come up. So what you do is you place the code with the possible error that you think will raise the exception. You place that inside a try clause. I'll show you an example of this. And then after that try clause, you have what's called an except clause. And the except clause contains code that you want to execute when the try clause, when the code inside the try clause throws the exception or raises the exception. So to give you an example, inside your try clause, you say z equals x divided by y, right? So that's the code that you want to execute that you think might raise an exception. Maybe it's going to divide by 0. Maybe y is equal to 0, right? Okay, so you suspect, look, this code might raise this exception, so I will put it inside this try clause. Now then right after the try clause, I have my except clause, except zero division error. So if a zero division error happens, this except clause will be executed. And in the except clause, I just say print divide by 0. Right? So all this is really doing is just reporting to me what the problem was. Right? But the idea is that if inside this try clause an exception is thrown that matches the exception after the word except, so specifically zero division error, right? If that exception is raised, then the code inside the except clause is executed, divide by 0. It prints it anyway. So in this case, it's very simple exception handling. It's not really going to fix anything. It's just going to print to you what went wrong. Okay, and that's all we're doing right now. So now we want to do this for sockets. So we have to know some basics about the errors that you can expect with sockets, some of the exceptions that can be raised. And every different type of method has different sets of exceptions that can be raised. And we're going to do a very easy job of this. We'll only handle sort of very generic errors and exceptions that are going to be raised. We're not going to go into great depth with the exception handling, but we need a little bit of it. So socket.error. That is an exception that is just generic. Any socket error is going to fall into this class of socket.error. Okay? So that's just the most generic type of socket exception that can be raised. And another type of exception that can be raised in this process is GAI error. So GAI stands for get address info error, right? GAI error. And remember, get address info, that does a DNS lookup. So you tell it www.google.com, you pass that as an argument to get address info, it'll tell you the IP address. If there's an error in that process, it doesn't find that host address, then it will raise a GAI error. Okay, so those are the two errors, two exception classes that we want to be able to handle. So we're going to change our code. So we went through, over a series of slides, we went through a generic client, okay, a generic network client and how you would make it. Now we're going to enhance that client by adding try and except statements to catch some of these errors as they occur and to just make the program more robust. And when I say catch, we're just going to report them. We're just going to print this error happened and that error happened, just so that it doesn't just crash in a generic way. At least we know how it failed if it fails. So here is our full-on client program. So this is really combining the slides that we did before, that we've done over the last few lectures, and adding try and except clauses to make the code more robust. Now what I've done is I put in red, highlighted in red, the actual code that I want to execute, and the rest of it are the try and except clauses and the except clauses, the error handling stuff. Now you notice at the top I import the socket. I import the socket package. I also import sys. Now why do I import sys? I import sys because I need to import the sys package so that I can call sys.exit. Now, the reason why I need sys.exit is because when these exceptions happen in my code, so say I'm trying to open a socket and it fails, right? I'm trying to get a domain name and it fails. When that happens, I want to just exit. I want to quit the program, okay? In order to do that, I need to call sys.exit. And so that's why I'm importing the sys package. So let's take a look at the beginning. The first thing. The first try, the first line that's highlighted in red, I'm creating the socket. We already looked at, right? So I create the socket, I call it my sock. That's in my try. Now you say except, you see right after it, except socket.error, print failed to create socket, sys.exit. So it just prints an error report that says, look, the socket creation failed for whatever reason, and it exits, and it quits right there. It doesn't try to execute the remaining lines of code. So that's why I'm using sys.exit. Now, after I create the socket, next thing I try is, next line in red is host equals socket.getHost by name. So I'm trying to get the host, the IP address. I try that, and if that fails, if my except socket.gai error, it says failed to get host, and it also does a sysexit. Now, the next line of code, it creates a connection to the host on port 80. It creates a message, which is a generic request message, which we've already seen. Then it does a tries to do a send all. So mysock.sendAll is in the try, and if there's a socket error on that, it reports fail to send and sysexit, it quits. Now, after that, data equals mysock.receive, so I'm receiving the data. It's only receiving 1,000 bytes, because that's the limit that I arbitrarily put in there. And that 1,000 bytes, in this case, would be, since I'm requesting a web page from Google, it's whatever appears on their first page, right? The contents, the HTML data, the stuff that appears on the screen, that's what I'm receiving, or the first 1,000 bytes of that anyway. Then I say print data, so I'm just going to print that to the screen. It's a pretty simple operation. I print it, and then I close the socket, and that's it. And this code would actually work, and you should try this, and you'll see that in another lecture. Thank you.